frontal lobe. So, again, the frontal lobe was the area that spans from the lateral fissure dorsally and caudally until the central sulcus. Let me try to encapsulate in a handful of sentences the overall job of the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is taxed with movement. Now, that might not seem that impressive, but hear me out. What's involved in movement? Well, it begins with some motivation, setting a goal, coming up with a strategy, preparing the movement, executing the movement, and essentially in real time, tracking the consequences of your movement to update the process. Now, that's a lot. That's why the frontal lobe gets so much attention because it is oh so critical. Another way I like to talk about the frontal lobe is as a simulator. A simulator is, most commonly a computer game or a computer program that allows you to experience something without having to actually go through it. Okay? What I mean by the frontal lobe being the world's greatest simulator is you don't have to do something in order to know how it'll turn out. If this wasn't perfectly human, you might have thought this was some kind of superpower. Truly. We can predict the future, not with certainty. Come on, this is not magic. But with a certain probability, we can predict weather patterns, which allows us to be better farmers, which allows agriculture. We can sometimes, to a certain extent, predict our enemies' actions. We can take their perspective. This is all frontal lobe. And to make it extremely um, silly, I'm in my home office now. If I grab my computer and throw it against the wall, I know exactly what will happen. I don't have to do it to understand. Your frontal lobe goes through so many permutations of possible strategies and possible outcomes the moment you're faced with a challenge. Let me give you just imagine you're going to a party back when humans used to do that. So you go to a party and you see somebody that you're interested in. Now, immediately, your frontal lobe, mostly below the level of conscious awareness, but sometimes consciously, you go into strategy mode. What can be done? Your goal is you'd like to be with this person. How are you going to go from being off in one corner with your friend, them being off in a corner with their friend? How do you reach your goal? Well, if you're anything like me, you do absolutely nothing. You go home and you cry. But if you're a normal person, you might come up with a workable strategy to meet this person and proceed with your evening. Now, we'll talk about what you did and also what you didn't do, because that is just as much frontal lobe function. And I'd say it's just as much a reflection of your personality as what you do. So that was a sort of a helicopter view Now let's take a little bit closer view. When you talk about movement, you have to talk about this gyrus right here. This is the primary motor cortex, and you see it wraps around. And what we're looking at here is the medial wall of opposite hemisphere. Okay? You see the motor cortex wraps around like a witch's finger wrapped around uh, the cortex. I don't know why one of my graduate school friends said that once and I never got it out of my head. This is the primary motor cortex where all of the neurons are that control, by going down your spinal cord and down to the parts of your body, all the muscles of your body. And through precise stimulation, we can make parts of your body move. Just in my humble opinion, but also that of a lot of people in their field, being able to read from this, from the output of the motor cortex, and relaying that output to an exoskeleton is likely going to be an earlier event than curing spinal cord injuries. But we'll see. However, if you could perfectly record, this is theoretical at this point, but if you could perfectly record activity of the motor cortex, you could theoretically perfectly control some exoskeleton. Anyhow, the motor cortex. Now, this is where movements are executed, but this is not where they begin. They begin far forward. But before we get there, let's talk about the pre-motor. Here, movements are planned and prepared. Here, they're executed. So, pre-motor, preparing the motor command, and also smoothing the motor pattern. And then the movement is executed in the motor cortex. Whereas the idea to move doesn't come here. Most often, we can think of that as coming from the prefrontal. Prefrontal cortex. Now here, most of the very high level features we associate with the frontal lobe are actually critically processed in this region here, the prefrontal. Working memory, attention, divided attention, impulse inhibition can also be influenced by this region. Planning, strategizing, what we call the executive functions. The next area of the frontal lobe I'd like to talk about is the OFC. Orbital, frontal, cortex. The orbit of the eye, where the eye sits, is right here. So the name is saying it's frontal cortex near the orbits. This region, if you remember from Psych 1, was a region that was obliterated by a rod in the case of Phineas Gage. So if you recall that story, I think you know where we're headed. The OFC is a major behavioral inhibition area. Here seem to be important judgments as to whether or not one path should or should not be taken. When I was a kid, I used to watch Tom and Jerry a lot, and there, one of them, usually the cat, would start to get really evil thoughts, and they would show a demon on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder, and the demon was tempting the cat to be very mean to the mouse, and the angel was trying to get the cat to be nice and forgiving. Well, the OFC I think of as the angel, as the part that says, hey, don't do that. That might embarrass us, or it might hurt us, or it might hurt someone we care about, or it might get us in legal trouble. That might disrupt my marriage if I did that. Self control, impulse inhibition. And wouldn't you know it, this is the last part of our brain to fully develop. Explains why younger folk are more risk taking, if you ask me. This takes roughly 25 years to finish developing. Now, whenever I talk about the OFC, I try to make sure to talk about balance here. I would argue that if you had a choice between a super strong OFC, meaning one that was able to inhibit your behavior very easily, and a very weak one that was very impulsive, I'd have to actually think about that for a minute. Because I have seen just as much disruption of lives come from people who might be over inhibited, people who tend to, their orbitofrontal calculus keeps resulting in, no, don't do that. Don't do that. That could be embarrassing. That could be harmful. That could be hurtful. Sure, impulsive actions get us in trouble as well. But I would argue for balance. The last part of the frontal lobe I want to talk about is a zone. It's not a precise area. Much of neuroanatomy is of this type, where we talk about a zone, a probabilistic spread, where my area might be this and your area might be smaller, to no detriment, just different. And maybe another's is completely outside the realm of mine. Nevertheless, this zone is commonly known as Broca's area. Broca's area is a language center. And I love this phenomenon that I'm about to speak of. So it's a language area. Let's look at the neighborhood. Okay, frontal lobe. Movement. Movement of what? Face, lips, mouth, throat. So, what aspect of language would you surmise brokers would be in charge of? Ah, speaking. More broadly, it's language production.